Thank you very much for the invitation and being part of this conference, which I think is really hitting a nerve when it comes to thinking about epistemologies. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm weirdly looking downwards because my notes are there, so don't be scared. So I want to start by looking at the landscape in which digital knowledge is being produced and reproduced today. And it's a landscape that is closely reflects the concerns raised in the conference calls. It involves at least expanding repositories, profit-driven access control, facts as the epistemic gold standard, and rapid innovation circles. What unites these dynamics is not just scale, but a shared epistemic tendency, the pursuit of singular, definitive knowledge outputs. This isn't just a design principle, it reflects a long-standing epistemic vision rooted in the 20th century logic empiricism and the Vienna Circle, now embedded in digital infrastructure. To analyze this complex constellation, I draw on two theoretical strands. In the first part, I want to address an epistemological concern, and therefore I will focus on Ludwig Fleck's account of knowledge genesis within epistemic frameworks. And in the second part of my talk, I will talk about an epistemical response to that. And here I will focus on Maria Puig de la Bella Casa's Matter of Care, a feminist extension of science and technology studies, particularly in Bruno Latour's work. So, part one. Concern, or the genesis and development of knowledge as a style of thinking. Fleck challenges the idea that knowledge is just a matter, in the late 1920s, Ludwig Fleck developed a nuanced view of knowledge as a social and historical process embedded in epistemic frameworks. For him, cognition and knowledge production is a social activity, never created in isolation. It always unfolds within specific historical, societal, and material contexts. His theory has two key components: the thought collective and the thought style. Fleck challenges the idea that knowledge is just a matter of choosing the right method or collecting the right data. Unlike what Henri Poincaré just a decade before him, or some decades before him, suggested, that with enough time and resources, all we need is to observe, and observe well. Fleck argued that knowledge doesn't come from individuals alone observing something. It emerges from thought collectives, communities where ideas circulate and epistemic labor is divided. His definition of the thought collective is a community of people engaged in the mutual exchange of ideas or intellectual interplay. It becomes the vehicle for the historical development of a domain of thought, a particular body of knowledge, and a specific cultural stage, thus a distinct thought style. A thought collective provides the frameworks within which anything can be known at all. For Fleck, to know is a relational term. Just as like left or bigger always needs a reference point, to be correct, one needs to say to know something according to a particular thought collective. What's true in one collective may be false in another. But I want to focus now on the second term of the concept, the thought style. Fleck defines this as the readiness for directed perception, with corresponding intellectual and objective processing of what has been perceived. It is characterized by the shared features of the problems that capture the interest of a thought collective, the judgments it considers evident, and the methods it employs as tools of inquiry. A thought collective defines what counts as legitimate objects of knowledge, which methods are valid and what counts it as evidence in the end. But more than that, it also shapes what can be perceived in the first place. Therefore, a thought style does not only constitute cognition and knowledge, but it also dictates what cannot be perceived otherwise. Fleck's idea of a thought style is not just about interpretation, it's about how perception itself is formed. This also means that thought styles come with thought constraints. To become part of a thought collective, a person must internalize its style of thinking. This is not automatic. It needs training, which is also highly relevant in AI. Fleck even calls it a kind of drilling. Think of the microscope as an example that Fleck uses prominently. I don't know if you remember the first time looking through a microscope. For me, it was in the 5th or 6th grade in biology. And I guess we had the skin of an onion and we were looking at the cells. And at first I saw shapes and shadows and gigantic tentacle monsters, up to the point that my biology teacher told me that there are no tentacle monsters. That was actually my eyelashes, and I shouldn't see it. And this is the point that Fleck points out here. You need to learn to see or to perceive and to do it the right way. This applies just as much to biology or medicine as it does to economics or neoliberalism. But thought styles don't just shape perception, they also exclude. Thought collectives naively believe to possess the correct answer, the correct way of thinking, whereas what others declare to be true, the so-called primitives, the ancient, the mentally ill, or the children, merely appears true to them. Thought collectives tend to reinforce themselves. They suppress thinking that doesn't fit the style. From within such a framework, alternative ideas often seem arbitrary, unjustified, or irrelevant. Fleck saw this as a form of epistemic violence, one that dissents from within and excludes outsiders, especially in institutionalized knowledge production. So the question raised for the given context is, if thought styles shape what can be perceived and known, what happens when those styles are monopolized by a handful of platforms and tech companies providing the infrastructure of knowing? Infrastructures that don't just host information, but increasingly shape what counts as knowledge in the first place. What we can see is that LLMs are trained within narrow epistemic frameworks, that economic and political interests shape what is learned or to be known, and alternative thought styles are increasingly foreclosed. Even platforms that promise plurality and dialogue, like Quora, rely on ranking algorithms that privilege visibility over epistemic quality. Google snippets exemplify the algorithmic reduction of plural inquiry into a singular, contextless answer. Access to knowledge is shaped by commercial logic, not only through paywalls, but also through algorithmic curation that privileges virality or advertising value. You probably remember the quote by then CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, from an interview in 2005, where he said, "When you use Google, do you get more than one answer? Of course you do. Well, that's a bug. We should be able to give you the right answer just once. We should know what you meant. You should look for information. We should get it exactly right, and we should give it to you in your language, and we should never be wrong. That's our challenge." This vision of knowledge is a single correct answer. It is not just a design choice, and it's not just technical ambition. It's an epistemic vision, one that treats ambiguity, pluralism, and dissent as bugs to be eliminated. Or, to put it more pointedly, Google making the Vienna Circle dream of unambiguous knowledge clickable. Fleck, by contrast, sees knowledge production as a social practice, one where silencing and exclusion aren't accidental side effects, but all part of the system. They help reinforce the thought collective's own knowledge claims. In doing so, Fleck anticipates what feminist epistemologies would articulate decades later through concepts like situated knowledge, weak objectivity, and epistemic violence. Fleck shows with great clarity how thought styles not only enable but also limit what can be known. What he only hints at, however, is how these limitations might be overcome. He doesn't give us a method, but he does leave traces. Again and again, he suggests that it is those at the epistemic margins, the outsiders, the others, whom Fleck identifies as potential disruptors, those who prevent epistemic frameworks from closing in on themselves and who help preserve space for ambiguity, which leads to part 2 of my contribution. Response. From matters of fact to matters of care, a shift from facts to concerns, from certainty to relationality, from extraction to engagement, an epistemology that does not promise final answers but foreground responsibility, relation, and care. This is where Latour's notion of matters of concern begins and where Bellacasa's matters of care takes it further. Let's begin with Latour. To develop his concepts of matters of concern, Latour digs a little bit into Heidegger. Don't worry, he doesn't follow through and we don't have to deal with Heidegger, at least in my talk. As so often, Latour looks at the etymology of a term as a starting point. This time it's the term thing. If we look in the English dictionary, Oxford English Dictionary, we see that thing has at least 2 different meanings. One, the obvious, that we are using today. A thing is that which exists individually in the most general sense, in fact or in idea. That which is or may be in any way an object of perception, knowledge, or thought. But there's a second meaning of a thing, which derives from the Old English or German Ting. A matter with which one is concerned, in action, speech, or thought. An affair, a business, a concern, a subject, a meeting, an assembly. Latour tries to introduce not opposites, but 2 different perspectives, 2 ways of knowing something. A thing is, in one sense, an object out there, and in another sense, an issue very much in there, at any rate, a gathering. The same word, thing, designates matters of fact and matters of concern. So I give you an example what he tries to view. So you can, for Latour, you can look at the same thing from 2 different angles. If you look at the thing from the perspective of matters of fact, the thing is singular, stable, externalized, and definitive. From the perspective of matters of concern, the same thing is gathered, situated, negotiated, and contested. The most prominent example Latour offers is the double helix structure of the DNA. As a matter of fact, the DNA molecule is presented as a biochemical structure with a precise universal form, 2 strands, contemporary base pairs, and a right-handed helix. This knowledge is treated as singular, stable, and universally valid. The double helix becomes an icon of modern science, elegant, self-evident, and objective. To view the double helix from the perspective of matters of concern, the structure emerges from a network of people, tools, practices, and institutions. We begin to ask who contributed. How was data interpreted, visualized, and shared? What role did power, gender, and institutions play? For example, Rosalind Franklin, whose work was crucial but largely erased from the discovery story. The double helix becomes a gathering of negotiations, omissions, and collaborations. Even its cultural reception, reducing life to information, becomes part of the concern. Taking matters of concern seriously, Latour writes, things are gathered again, merging matters of fact into highly complex, historically situated, richly diverse matters of concern. So matters of fact are always only one part of the matters of concern, one that is usually being able to measure or to operationalize. Knowledge from this perspective is understood only in its coming together, as the negotiation of actors, relations, materiality, powers, and so on. While matters of fact appear bounded, predictable, and even controllable, matters of concern overflow. They become layered, multidimensional, and complex. And right here is where Bella Casa comes into play. She offers yet another shift from matters of concern to matters of care. The purpose of showing how things are assembled is not to dismantle things. Instead, we need to exhibit the concerns that attach and hold together matters of fact. We remember, for Schmidt, ambiguity in knowledge is a bug, something to be eliminated in the pursuit of the one correct answer. Bella Casa, by contrast, reminds us that knowledge is never isolated. It's assembled, fragile, and held together by actors, materiality, needs, and visions. Her point is not only to acknowledge complexity, but to care for it. But why does knowledge need caring? Bella Casa's argument for matters of care invites us to understand knowledge differently. First, that knowledge is vulnerable, because what is composed can also come apart. Second, that it requires ongoing maintenance, because its stability is never given, but needs to be sustained through care and divided labor. And third, that we are always already implicated. Knowledge is not outside of us, but something we are epistemologically and ethically entangled with. This is where Bella Casa decisively extends Latour's notion of concern. The notion of matters of care aims to add something to matters of concern with the intention of not only representing and respecting things, but of engaging with their becoming. One can make oneself concerned, but to care more strongly directs us to a notion of material doing. Understanding caring as something we do extends the vision of care as an ethically and politically charged practice. While concern calls for recognition, a cognitive attentiveness to complexity of things, care moves us further. Care is about an effective state, engaging with it, sustaining it, responding to it. In this sense, knowledge is not simply something to be obtained or understood, but the practical responsibility to take care of the fragile gathering it constitutes. So here's a modest attempt to visualize the three interwoven ways of relating to knowledge. What first appears as a matter of fact is a discrete piece of knowledge or information. When we zoom out, we view the thing represented as a matter of concern. We realize that surrounding it is the gathering that sustains and contextualizes it. And finally, holding both together, we find care, not as another interpretation, but as a practice, a gesture of maintenance, responsibility, and involvement. For Bella Casa, it signifies an effective state, a material vital doing, and an ethical political obligation. Epistemic care, at least in my opinion, applies not only to those who produce knowledge, which most critical epistemologies focus on, for example, with the focus on epistemic virtues or the whole context of discovery. It also applies to those who search for, receive, and rely on any kind of knowledge. It is the practice addressing the vulnerability of knowledge and those who are neglected or silenced in its becoming. So if there's one thing you take home from my talk, let it be the image of two hands carefully holding something that looks suspiciously like a fried egg. I can live with that. So the question becomes, can this concept guide actual research and knowledge production? I want to give you two examples where I think it applies. Sandra Harding and Brani Mendoza offer a powerful example of what epistemic care might look like in practice. In their 2020 paper titled Latin American Decolonial Feminist Philosophy of Knowledge Production, which is a mouthful, they are tracing how colonial thought collectives or regimes of knowledge erased indigenous understanding of, in their case, gender and sexuality. And both are arguing that restoring these epistemic worlds, these styles of thinking, is not just a political project, it's a care-based response to historical epistemic violence. In their abstract, they write, in the Latin American feminist challenges to the standard modern Western ontological and epistemological tendencies in their thought styles, one can see the parochiality, thank you, of the latter, which is still rooted in the imperial histories. These new dialogues give us the opportunity to engage, these new debates give us a new opportunity to engage in a dialogue about how reliable knowledge should be produced, that we can wish would have been produced some 500 years ago. Building on the previous example, let us view a more practical care. Sarah Schönbauer just recently illustrated how integrating care principles into technology assessment can lead to more holistic and responsible approaches to environmental challenges. In her article, Careful Handling of Marine Plastic Litter, Technology Assessment and Care, she writes, what is the core concern of today's societies? Waste is a core concern of today's societies. A prominent example is marine plastic litter, which has devastating impacts on ocean ecosystems. In this article, I show that care concepts can help understanding the complexity of waste management, as well as the environments involved, recreation processes, and technical innovations. Moreover, care concepts could benefit TA practice by sensitizing it not only to cultural, regional, and global concerns, but also to the distribution of responsibility and marginalization processes. So what does it mean to implement epistemic care in the very infrastructure that shape what count as knowledge? These examples, from erased indigenous epistemologies to environmental assessment, already show that care is not an abstract idea. It can reorient how we act, assess, and relate. If we take care seriously as an epistemic perspective, we must acknowledge that epistemic systems are always ethical political, that digital infrastructures are not neutral hosts providing definitive knowledge. Recall Eric Schmidt's vision of the one right answer. And the responsibility then lies, at the very least, in resisting epistemic closure. Here is where care gets important. So to sum it up, to understand digital knowledge practice as a matter of care is to challenge the idea that knowledge is a tradable commodity, an externalized object to be accumulated, circulated, and debunked at will. It is to recognize that knowledge emerges from situated, relational, and often exclusionary frameworks, echoing Fleck's insight that what can be known is shaped by the constraints and possibilities of its sought styles. Caring for knowledge means keeping those frameworks open. This perspective not only protects the integrity of knowledge from epistemic monopolization, but also foregrounds our unavoidable engagement or entanglement with it. And in the entanglement, I argue, lies the core epistemic responsibility in the age of digital knowledge production. So that would be my takeaway message for you, and don't forget the hands holding the fried egg. Thank you very much.